The folder had no subject line, just a number. Subproject 130. And below it, in handwriting that did not match any typed form, a single word. Behavior. It was filed under Girhin MK Ultra, but the index card was misaligned, as if someone wanted it to disappear without destroying it. They called them volunteers, but the signatures were uneven. Some slanted left, others drawn by a hand that shook. The initials were rarely the same as the names in the roster. Some of the subjects were prisoners, some patients who thought they were being treated, some soldiers who signed nothing at all. The promise was always care, research, rehabilitation. The result was silence. I first saw the reel in a basement, not Langley, not Fort Detrick, a local university archive, misfiled under behavioral science outreach. A reel-to-reel cassette, unlabeled except for a black mark. The technician who left it there must have believed no one would listen. The tape hissed. The voices were slow, measured, detached. Not a classroom, not a lab. It was a clinic disguised as a prison cell. A man's voice asked, "When I tell you to close your eyes, what do you see?" The subject responded, "Light." And then nothing. Another voice, "Increased dosage." And then silence. This was MK Ultra. At its most ordinary, not the dramatic trials, not the headlines about LSD, but the slow grind of programming. Behavior broken down into sequences, like a machine code written into flesh. They called it psychic driving. They called it repatterning. They called it behavioral modification. But inside the file, one line repeated across memos. Aim: to reduce the human subject to a state of total pliability. They believed they could reset a mind the way you reset a tape. Play a phrase again and again, overlay it with shocks, with chemicals, with deprivation, until the subject forgot the world before. It was not a hallucination program. It was not designed for visions. It was designed for erasure, for the manufacturing of absence, and in the absence, new instruction could be written. Simple commands repeated in monotone. Sleep now. Wake when told. Obey without pause. Not to create monsters, but to create silence. Soldiers who remembered nothing. Agents who followed orders, then disappeared. Patients who signed forms, then forgot their names. The papers mention Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, head of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. He received funds through front organizations, believing he was serving science. His method: play a single recorded phrase hundreds of thousands of times to a subject kept sedated for weeks. Some phrases were trivial. You are a good mother. Others were procedural. Your past has been erased. You will not resist authority. The repetition was not for persuasion. It was for saturation, until the subject could no longer distinguish where the phrase ended and the self began. The file notes casualties. Some never woke. Some woke without memory of language. One woman, patient 0461, was recorded as repeating only one line over and over. They took my thoughts away. She said it in English. She said it in French. She said it in fragments, but she did not stop. For 7 years. What the archives never call them is victims. They are cases, subjects, patients. Their names appear once, then vanish. Cross-referenced with prisons, hospitals, military barracks. Always shuffled, always lost. Some had files marked redacted for national security. Others had nothing at all, just an empty folder. The absence louder than the contents. It was not only America. Programs mirrored in Canada, in Britain, in Germany. Anywhere the Cold War demanded obedience. And yet, buried in Subproject 130 was something colder than experiment. A series of internal memos, no longer about research, but about application. Field readiness of behaviorally modified subjects remains untested. Recommend limited deployment scenarios under controlled supervision. Memory suppression, stable beyond 30 days. Reactivation protocols pending. They were not just studying minds, they were building a system. Disposable agents, programmable obedience, human beings whose memories could be erased and rewritten like cassettes. The file calls them zombies. Not in headlines, not in reports for Congress, but in the internal shorthand of memos, among men who knew the word would never be read. Zombies. Field viable after 3x wipe. Responsive to primary command sequence. Secondary commands unstable. It was not fiction. It was not a metaphor. It was the word they used when the subject ceased to resist, ceased to remember, ceased to exist except as a shell for instruction. One document outlined a training scenario. Subject instructed to enter secure building, deliver package, exit without engagement. Subject recalls nothing post-operation. Another described a test failure. Subject froze at entry, began repeating phrase, became non-functional, neutralized, not rescued, not treated, just erased again, by different means. I remember holding the pages, the weight of the paper heavier than it should have been. The ink faded, but the intent permanent. No room for doubt, no space for speculation. The United States government, through its intelligence arms and its medical proxies, attempted to erase people and rebuild them as instruments. And in the index of Subproject 130, a final line. Note, further research discontinued. Files transferred to Langley, 1966. Discontinued does not mean destroyed. Transferred does not mean ended. It means hidden. It means waiting. What you find in these archives is not a single scandal. It is a pattern. Documents repeat. Words echo across memos. The same handwriting appears in unrelated files. Dates overlap where they should not. You begin to see the method. The erasure was not just of memory in subjects. It was of memory in the institution itself. To forget the scope, to forget the names, to forget that the intent was ever real. But the files remain, and the files whisper louder than silence. In one appendix, an anonymous reviewer writes, "Recommend cessation of this line of inquiry. Unreliable, immoral, politically indefensible." But the memo is unsigned. The initials are missing. The page number is off by one, as if the objection itself was meant to be erased. I cannot tell you how many people were used. The records contradict. Some say hundreds, others thousands. Some survived. Some lived entire lives, never knowing that their gaps in memory, their sudden fears, their strange compulsions, were not accidents of the mind, but fragments of a program they never consented to. The truth is, they did not need millions. They needed enough to test, enough to prove the concept, enough to demonstrate obedience in silence. The rest could be forgotten. Forgotten in the same way the subjects were. The word zombie lingers. It was not superstition. It was not myth. It was bureaucratic shorthand for a person emptied out, reduced to function, operating without will. The Cold War wanted weapons that did not look like weapons. And what better weapon than a human who no longer belonged to themselves? What better outcome than a subject who could act, deliver, obey, and then forget? But the truth they never controlled was memory itself. Not the laboratory kind, but the institutional kind. The whispers left in margins, the reels left misfiled, the folders that slip through cracks. Memory cannot be fully erased. It resurfaces where least expected, like this tape, like this file, like this testimony you were never meant to hear. And so, discovery bleeds into pattern. The reel is not the only reel. The file is not the only file. The number 130 is not the only number. Once you see it, you begin to recognize it everywhere. The reel ends, but the echo continues. Because once the first fragment surfaces, others follow. They were scattered like ash across archives, small enough to look meaningless, together enough to sketch the outline of intent. Another file, this one labeled Bluebird, later renamed Artichoke, predecessors to Ultra, the roots beneath the name. The questions in those pages were written not as philosophy, but as directives. Can we control an individual to the point of performance against their will? Can we alter memory so the act is never recalled? Can we induce amnesia, hallucination, obedience without visible coercion? The answers came back as progress reports. Not theories, not speculations. Results. Yes, under certain conditions, the pattern of methods repeats. Sleep deprivation, electroshock, hypnotherapy, LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, isolation. Each not new, but each refined into sequences, like notes in a machine-driven song. They called it the question of the disposal problem. Because when an agent or a subject remembered too much, they became dangerous. The most reliable method of disposal? Erasure. First of memory, then of life. At Fort Detrick, documents showed joint work with chemical divisions. Not just how to induce obedience, but how to guarantee silence afterward. Syringes marked with numbers, not names. Vials recorded in triplicate. And the phrase, when termination is required, memory gaps render explanation impossible. It was not enough to create obedience. They had to create disposability. The paper trail grows stranger with every cross-reference. NSA intercept logs mention names that appear in CIA payrolls. Army research hospitals share patient IDs with prison experiments. Universities publish harmless studies on sleep, while their basements host locked rooms with no windows. The connections are not supposed to be visible. Yet the handwriting, the repeated phrases, the misaligned numbering, all betray a single architecture. It is not one program. It is a network of programs. MK Ultra is just one door. Behind it, Bluebird, Artichoke, Monarch, Chatter. Each with a different name, each with the same intent. Some of the documents describe memory fragments, a subject programmed to carry information across borders, with instructions buried beneath hypnosis. The memory would not surface until a phrase was spoken. Bluebird has landed. It is midnight in Montreal. These triggers were written as codes. But the codes required something else, the breaking of a life into pieces, the memory of family removed, the memory of time distorted, a life reduced to fragments that could be played or silenced at will. One file, declassified in part, contains a chart, columns of names. Beside each, words like obedient, resistant, non-viable, terminated. No surnames, only initials. No dates, only vague years. 1953, 1956, 1964. The chart looks like inventory, but each row was a human life. Some ended with neutralized. Others, released. But what does release mean when memory itself has been taken? By the mid-60s, the word ultra was toxic. Congress whispered of exposure. The press sniffed at the edges. So the name changed. The funding shifted. But the work did not stop. Instead, fragments appear in adjacent programs. Behavioral studies, funded by the Office of Naval Research. Prison experiments under contracts with private firms. Medical grants awarded for insomnia research. The same signatures drift across them. The same initials. The same phrases. Reduce subject to pliability. Total behavior control achievable. The program collapses into 1,000 smaller shapes, like glass shattering, but every shard cuts the same way. In the collapse, something darker emerges. Not just obedience, but duplication. A file marked Monarch, no official program, yet referenced in fragments of interviews. Subject exhibits dual state after conditioning. Original identity suppressed. Secondary identity responsive to control. This was not simply erasure, it was replacement. The creation of layers in a person's mind, with one layer unaware of the other. A soldier who lived as a clerk, but who, when triggered, could become something else. It reads like fiction, but the memos are not written as speculation. They are evaluations. Subject demonstrates stability after 4 months, primary unaware, secondary responsive. A person living 2 lives, one free, one captive, neither aware of the other. There are transcripts of interviews. One subject, asked to describe her life, began speaking of her children, her work. Then, mid-sentence, she shifted tone. Her words slowed. She said, "Awaiting orders." The interviewer noted, "Secondary state activated spontaneously. Requires further study." When she returned to her first state, she had no memory of the conversation. None at all. She wept when shown the transcript. She said, "This is not me." But it was her voice, her handwriting, her body. The files grow inconsistent here. Pages redacted, whole paragraphs blacked out. But what remains is enough to see the collapse. One memo warns, the instability of secondary states increases over time. Memory leaks possible. Subjects begin to question reality. Containment requires continuous reinforcement. In plain terms, the mind does not stay silent. The erased fragments fight to return, and when they return, they come back broken. One subject wrote in a journal, the handwriting shaky, uneven. "They tell me I am two, but I feel like I am none. Voices overlap. Memories not mine. I do not know which is real. Please, if someone finds this, remember me." The journal was recovered after her death, the cause listed as natural. The notes, inconclusive. But in the margin of the file, someone wrote, in pencil, "Memory retention beyond protocol thresholds, 3 times wiped." Even in collapse, the truth surfaced. Even in erasure, fragments resisted. The second cliff comes with the word deployment. Because as the 60s closed and Ultra was supposedly shut down, memos began speaking of field operations. Modified subject, placed in overseas environment, performance stable, commands executed, subject retains no conscious recall. No country listed, no operation identified, but the implication clear. These were not just lab cases anymore. They were being used, and once used, they were discarded. Returned to hospitals, released into the public, labeled unstable, schizophrenic, paranoid. Forgotten in wards, in prisons, in families who thought they had simply lost their minds. The tragedy is not that the files end. The tragedy is that the people did not. They lived in silence. They lived in confusion. They lived in gaps. They carried memories that were not theirs. They carried voids where years should be. They carried compulsions they could not explain, and no one believed them. Because the programs were never meant to exist, and the victims were never meant to be heard. This is the collapse, not only of programs, but of lives, of memory, of trust. The institutions deny, the governments redact, but the evidence lingers, in fragments, in whispers and patterns, enough to know it was real, too little to know its full extent. And in that silence, a second erasure takes place, the erasure of history itself. Two cliffhangers remain. The first, an appendix in the subproject 130 file listing numbers with no explanation. 037 112 241. Beside them, status unknown. No names, no dates, just unknown. The second, a set of photographs mislabeled as medical training. Black and white, subject seated, eyes closed, headphones on, wires attached. In the background, a clock without hands. Every photo shows the same room, but no blueprint, no floor plan, admits the room existed. Langley Archives list no room 93, and yet the memos reference it. Room 93 subjects demonstrate improved response rates. A room that is not there, a file that is not named, a history that is not written. The collapse is not the end. It is the preparation for silence. Because after collapse, what remains is truth. And the truth was never meant to be spoken. Truth is quieter than collapse. Not the sound of paper shredders or redactions. Not the shock of exposure, but the quiet of recognition. The moment you realize it was not a mistake, it was design. The documents make it plain, though they never say it in full. A subject stripped of memory is not an accident of science. It is an asset. A soldier who will not break under interrogation because there is nothing left to confess. An operative who can deliver, obey, disappear, because he himself remembers nothing of the act. A citizen who testifies to nothing because her own mind does not belong to her. They were not trying to cure. They were not trying to heal. They were trying to weaponize forgetting. This is the truth. MK Ultra was not abandoned because it failed. It was abandoned because it succeeded, and success cannot survive scrutiny. The public could be scandalized by drugs, by hypnosis, by bizarre experiments in universities. But the deeper truth was unmentionable. That obedience could be manufactured through the destruction of self. That people could be turned into blanks, shells, zombies, if you want to use the word they used. Not Walking Dead, not horror, just erased, rewritten, alive, without memory of their own. The truth is also this. It did not stop. Names changed, funding routes diverted, applications hidden under private contracts, classified as defense research, or buried in psychiatric studies. The methods survive because the need survives. Every intelligence service wants silence. Every government wants control. Every institution, once given the power to erase, cannot resist using it. And so it continues, in fragments, in shadows, not called Ultra, not called Bluebird, not even filed in the same buildings, but alive in the architecture of secrecy. The survivors speak when they can, not with clarity, but with fragments. They say, there are years I cannot account for. They say, I wake with words in my head that are not mine. They say, I feel I lived another life, but no one believes me. Institutions call them unstable. Doctors label them schizophrenic. Families distance themselves. Because how do you prove a memory stolen? How do you prove an absence? How do you prove an erased self? You can't. That is the perfection of the design. One transcript remains lodged in my head. Interview with subject 0461. The same patient who once repeated, "They took my thoughts away." The interview took place decades later. The voice is older, fragile. The interviewer asks, "Do you remember the Institute?" She pauses and then says, "I remember nothing, but I remember the nothing clearly." That paradox is the truth. Memory of nothing, clearer than memory of life. The wound of absence, sharper than pain. This is where truth ends, not in revelation, but in recognition that the erased cannot be restored, that the programs did not end, that the documents are fragments, never whole, and that what is gone forever. The truth is too late. The files surface when the people are dead. The names appear when the families are gone. The confessions arrive in hearings that no one watches anymore. History remembers the scandal, but not the silence that followed. Silence is the real weapon. Now comes the last phase, silence. Because once the truth surfaces, it does not free you, it binds you. You realize that you too are watched, measured, filed, that the same institutions which erased them archive you, that every word, every call, every search enters a system not designed for memory, but for control. They no longer need rooms without windows. They no longer need hidden reels. The world itself is the laboratory now. The surveillance gridded the cage, the algorithm, the hypnotic phrase, the repetition, the programming, the methods refined in secrecy now embedded in daily life. Obedience through distraction, compliance through saturation. Memory shaped by feeds, by loops, by headlines. The silence is deeper now because it is chosen, not by them, by us. The archive closes here, not because it is complete, but because it cannot be completed. Every missing page is another silence. Every erased name is another life gone. Every word redacted is another fragment we will never recover. But the weight remains. You feel it in the misfiled reel, in the handwriting in margins, in the subjects whose voices survive on tape, long after their names are forgotten. You feel it in the paradox. That erasure does not vanish. It lingers. It leaves a shape, an outline of what once was, a silence too sharp to ignore. And so I leave you with this. Room 93 does not exist, and yet memos reference it. Subproject 130 was discontinued, and yet the methods echo everywhere. The word zombie was never public, and yet it was written in files by men who believed no one would see. Now you have seen. The silence is broken briefly, but soon it will close again, because that is what silence does. It closes, it seals, it waits. And when it returns, you will ask yourself, was it real? Did I really hear this? Or is my memory playing tricks? That is the final truth. You will doubt, because doubt is the deepest form of erasure. And that is how they win. The file is closed, the voices stop, the room is empty, and the silence is complete.